Today we're going to take a look at the palette knife. I'm going to do a small color study with a palette knife. I'll talk about the different palette knives I use. And I usually use the palette knife for color studies because it allows me to get thicker paint easier. And you can tell how the colors are going to interact together when the paint is thicker. So if you're struggling with getting your paint thick enough, if your paint is always thin, it's a good idea to do some exercises with palette knife because you'll really see the importance of thick paint when you use palette knife because it's hard to mix thin paint with a palette knife. All right, today we're talking about how to use a palette knife, or when to use a palette knife, or maybe when not to use a palette knife. For me, a palette knife, and I've got 3 of them here I'm going to talk about and use. Palette knife is best to show thick paint. It is hard to put down thin paint with a palette knife. So if you're struggling with using thick paint, you just can't seem to get your paint thick enough, it's always real thin, put your brush down and use a palette knife because you will see the impact of thicker paint right away. So it's a big help there. But in my painting, palette knives, they produce big flat areas of thick paint. So an area that has a ton of texture, which is most things in painting, it's not real good for. Although I'm going to use it in everything on this. But the more texture something has, like the tree has a lot of texture, it's rough. Grass, not so much. The grass is a little flatter, a field. Rocks, there's a lot of texture to them, so using a palette knife isn't as beneficial. Although the bigger the rock, to paint a big flat area, a flat side or the top of a rock that's flat and light, the palette knife is very good for. So flat things, flat parts of a sky, flat side of a mountain, snow that doesn't have much texture or value change in it, you know, like horses going through a bunch of snow, it'd be really textured, so it wouldn't work as well. But a big field of snow, ice, streams, big flat areas where you can put down big flat thing of paint, the palette knife really works good with. Plus the idea that the palette knife gives you contrasting surface. So a brush stroke looks totally different from a palette knife. So if I have a painting, 98% brush strokes and 2% few spots of palette knife, that's going to work real well because there's a contrast there of types of paint application. You know, you want thinner paint, you want thicker paint, you want choppy brush strokes, you want straight brush strokes, and you want a few areas of palette knife. Again, where things are flatter, lighter, and don't have much value change to them. Now, the other thing palette knife is good for is for practice. Like I mentioned, if you have trouble getting your paint thick enough, use palette knife. And don't just use it once. Put your brushes away and do 25 palette knife paintings. I recommend small because you can get more done and you can see the impact right away. You just learn more from smaller paintings. Try some bigger ones too, but it just really gives you a good feeling of what thick paint looks like and does. If you're constantly struggling to get your paint thick enough, use a palette knife. And you'll see the impact of the thicker paint right away. It makes the color better. Color looks kind of scratchy and dull when it's thin. You can use thicker paint to show the form better by following like the shape of the trees, shape of the mountains. So thicker paint gives you better form, better color. And so again, put the brush away, use some palette knives to work that out. And think of these as exercises. If every painting you paint is a finished painting that you're gonna show somebody, put in a show, put in a gallery, give to somebody, then you're not gonna learn anything because we tend to tighten up. We tend to not think outside the box. But if everything is a practice, then we're going to experiment more, stretch ourselves more, and learn a lot more. So that's enough talking. I'm going to continue talking, but I'm going to start painting. I'm going to block this whole thing with the palette knife, and then come back and show where I would use brush work, drag a brush through it, and where I would leave the palette knife. If I'm outside and working small and I don't have much time, I will paint with the palette knife because I can get big areas down a lot quicker, and then come back in a few areas with the brush and just drag through the thicker paint. So the palette knives I'm going to use for smaller painting are this smaller teardrop one right here. It gets in smaller areas. I like the longer, thinner one. I did have a long, straight one, but it's good for smaller areas too, but long, thin areas, and then a bigger one for bigger areas if I'm going to come in here and chop in bigger. So it's kind of like small brushes and big brushes. They just happen to be palette knives. So I'm going to start in the background. Well, let me show you real quickly what I'm working on in the iPad. This scene here, this is in Capitol Reef, Utah, southern Utah. So a lot of darks, a lot of light, you know, strong dark and light, not much halftone. Too much halftone, I will lose the light. So I'm going to block it in and keep the paint thick, and then come back with a brush and knock down some of the palette knife strokes. So the first thing I'll attack here is the mountains. I see them as more of a blue-green, and what I have down here already is just a quick wash of color and value. It's more about the value than it is the color, because I want to make sure the values work together before I start laying on thick paint. So I'm going to do kind of a bluish green. My palette over here is Viridian, Violet, Ultramarine, Alizarin Crimson, Burnt Sienna, Cad Orange, Yellow Ochre, Cad Yellow Light, and White. I got a little bit of palette scrapings over there, just kind of a muted. So I'm going to add a little bit of Cad Yellow to the blue. And don't be afraid of wasting paint, because then you will never paint thick enough to see what thick paint does. Now in the shadows, generally shadows are thinner. So I'm going to come back, either drag a brush through the shadows, and I'm blocking it with palette knife, or drag a palette knife over it to knock down the thickness. But this gives me the strong color right off the bat. And I don't have to worry about the trees. I can cut into the trees a little bit, because the trees are going to overlap the background. And I'm using the longer palette knife here. I can let some of the toned board or canvas show through this tone here, because it's somewhat the same value, so if it shows through a little bit, it's not going to hurt anything. And I don't have to fill up all the space where the mountains are, again, because I have it toned the right value. But also I can leave a few areas so I can come back and add a little bit of subtle color change. So I don't want it all the same value in the shadow. I do want the lighter parts of this mountain to be a little bit lighter, but also a subtle color change within the shadow. So I got a blue-green here. I'm going to stay in the blue family and just do a blue-violet. Somewhat the same value. And this is just color for color's sake. It pushes the blue-green back a little bit. Gives me some color variation. But I'm not changing the overall value, just adding a little color variation. Now for the light, and the light's going to be warmer and a bit thicker. So I'm going to go white and orange. Orange is probably the coolest or the least intense of the lighter warm colors, the cad yellow, yellow ochre. Even the burnt sienna is just not as intense. So this is the background color, so I don't want it as intense. So white and orange, as opposed to cad yellow. Putting that in the background would be too much. So I added a little bit of violet to the orange, still warm, but it's muted and of course very light. And I'm going to load up the edge of the brush here, or palette knife. See, I have it piled on there, and I'm going to look for the areas that catch the sunlight. And just load it on there. A little bit of it here on top of the these red cliffs that are in front of the green ones. Now for the red-violet cliffs in front, and I'm going to use alizarin crimson or burnt sienna. They're going to be slightly lighter. I have to think value first. They're slightly lighter than the blue-green cliffs and a bit warmer. So crimson and burnt sienna give me a red that's somewhat muted. Then add a little bit of blue to it as well. Again, if I don't load it up, nothing really comes off the palette knife. So I'm loading it up on there. Didn't quite mix up enough. This also forces me to simplify. I mean, again, we're talking about practice. I can practice simplifying my subject. Because again, with a palette knife, you can't pick at it. It is it's big, unwieldy. It's not a tiny little 3-hair brush that we can just pick away forever on. Now I'm going to go to the yellow trees, the cottonwoods, and get some cad yellow, orange, and then some violet, so I'm going to block in the shadows first. Now this is where I would use more of a brush, but for the sake of exercise here, of just, again, getting that feel for thick paint and how it really affects your painting. I still would like a thinner shadows, thicker lights. But again, as an exercise once in a while, throw it out the window and just lay it all in thick. Now this is the shadow of the tree, of the yellow tree, the cottonwood. Of course, yellow is not a dark color. Even yellow in the shadow, as you can see, is pretty light compared to the background mountains. And again, the wash of yellow that I put down first, kind of the drawing stage, it's the same value as what I'm putting in thick now. So I can let some of that wash show through slightly. Now I want to hit the light area. So I'm going to get white, cad yellow, and I'm consciously going to make it thicker. A little bit of orange. It's kind of a real pale yellow orange. The big thing about, palette knife, just like with everything else, the most important thing is the value of the color you're putting down. So I can have, just nice palette knife strokes, but if the value of the color is wrong, it's just not going to work. The other thing is I could apply the paint with a stick and have not so great paint application, but if my values are right, it'll still work on some level. It'll still kind of read. So remember that. Don't fall in love with tricky techniques. Focus more on how you compose the shapes, simplify the shapes, and then the value of the shapes. Then color and technique will kind of take care of itself eventually. Just getting some of these lights in here. And in my drawing stage where I washed in those colors, I was pretty careful with the big shape. Wasn't careful with any detail. But as far as the big shape, getting these shapes the right proportion, right size, pretty careful with that. I'm going to add a little bit of that orange and violet into the green. Maybe a touch of blue, get it slightly greener for these lights here. Gonna have to go a little darker for the darks. Harder when the objects are smaller, like the shrubbery, to use the palette knife. I could use the smaller one, so I think I should. And come in here and lay in the shadow a little bit. The nice thing about the palette knife too is it keeps me from getting things too picky. It's hard to do individual blades of grass or get too tiny and picky with a palette knife. As soon as I say that, I get a small little value to get some dark accents in here. I dropped the palette knife. And I'm not, even though I'm adding small little detail now, the dark accent, I'm not going to overdo it. Just keep it very simple. Because even whether it's palette knife or a brush, the value relationships, you know, the temperature contrast relationships, warm against cool, all that's going to be more important than how I apply the paint, palette knife or brush. Keeping it simple. Now, the more I work, the smaller the areas are that I'm working on. There's a little bit of a violet hill mixed in with a little bit of green. In here. Again, you can't get a thin application with palette knife, just no paint comes off. You got to load it up. So when you try and get picky and detailed with it, it just will not work as well. So again, that's another good point of using a palette knife, is it does keep things very simple. And I don't care for that, so I'm going to take a brush. I'm going to get a little orange and burnt sienna, a little bit lighter, and warm this up. That's a bit too cold. lose the hard edge on that. Back to the palette knife, since it is a palette knife video. I'll get the orange again. I want to get some lights on here. I need some contrast right there. And again, I can't finesse anything with this, which is kind of the good thing and the bad thing. But it does make definite statements. And you have to pick and choose what you want. If I want a lot of finesse and some detail, I better stick with a brush. But if I'm trying to get rid of that, if I want to get looser feel, then use a palette knife. And I don't do palette knife paintings per se. I will use a palette knife sometimes in the painting, but I will do palette knife paintings as an exercise to, again, kind of think outside the box, thick paint wise. Now I want to get some orange and ochre. I'm going to lay this field in. And the field is a great place here for just a lot of variation of color. That's the same value. What I don't want is the same intensity and color as the trees. So trees are more cad yellow and orange. I'm going to use more yellow ochre. Maybe a little bit of orange, but I'm not going to use any cadmium yellow or cad yellow light, because I want a difference in color, for one thing, because it is a different color, but it's also not as intense, which I might come back into it and drag a little bit of violet to knock it down even more. And it helps to have thick paint where you want to go back in and scrub some color into. If I lay this grass in really thin, and then I want to affect that color with another color, like mute it slightly with violet or cool it with a little blue or something, it won't do anything because I don't have it thick enough. Now you can see the difference, the ochre and the cad yellow and orange. Now let's vary that, same value or real close to the same value. Put some alizarin crimson in it. A little bit of ochre into the crimson. A subtle change there. I'm going to get a little violet. I do see some violet. It's violet because it's glare from the light and it's turning that ochre a little bit cooler just because it becomes almost just a glare. Some violet in the distance. Get a little viridian, which is a bluish green. My viridian is a viridian hue, so it's more of a stronger green. A viridian hue is really just phthalo green and a little white. Might have a little something else in it. That's a pretty strong color. I don't care for that over there. So I'll kind of blend it in a little bit. Scrape that out. Which is what the other thing that palette knife is good for. It's good for scraping. And that's what I use it the most for, is to scrape mistakes, but also I block things in real quick and then just scrape so that I have the same drawing, the same value. But I've just taken down the thick paint so I can kind of repaint it. And that's much easier to do because you have all the colors in there, all the values in there. But now you have more texture of the canvas or board to lay paint on top of because it's dry or really scraped. And I haven't touched the color in here yet in the shadow. I might leave that. That works pretty good. That's just the wash of violet I threw down there. Had a little burnt sienna in it, so it's somewhat muted. But I think that works pretty good, just as it is. Now I want to lay in a little sky. This is a bare tree here, bare cottonwood, as opposed to the cottonwood with the foliage still left. And I want a couple of values. I'm going to lay in Viridian and white. It's kind of a warm sky. The sun is over here to the left, but it's in front of me, so which kind of warms up the sky. I want to emphasize the sharpness of the angular shapes of the cliff here. And I can, again, load up the edge and just come right on the line and pull up. And then a little bluer, a little ultramarine blue. It's going to look kind of gray. I think I have some yellow in that. So I want it pretty clean. So white and ultramarine blue. And it gets a little darker than the Viridian I have down there because the sky gets darker as it goes up. And it gets a little cooler, so the ultramarine is a bit cooler than ultramarine is a little cooler than Viridian, if not a lot cooler. Left-handed. Now I add some blue to this yellow, get it cooled down a little bit. And I want a little bit of sunlight on that edge back in there. And a softer edge, because it's a rounded part in there. So now I can look at it and come back and use the brush. I want to leave palette knife on the hill in here because I think that works well on the grass. I need to get a little variation in the trees and also some blending in the sky from the lighter to the darker. So it creates kind of a middle value in there. Now I could use the brush, clean brush, to come back in all of it, knock down the palette knife strokes, and just drag a brush through the thick paint. But I want to leave some of it. I can take some of the yellow, shadowed yellow tree and push up into the light area and get some of the light area a bit thinner. But I got a lot of thick paint to work with now. I can use the brush to get the trees, they just have a bit more of an organic shape because the palette knife doesn't do that. It's pretty angular. Or the shapes are, they don't have much variation in those thin lights. They're all kind of the same. So I can lay the lights and darks in here a little bit thicker. A little bit thinner or thicker to get some variation in there. Can push and pull to soften some edges, but I can also do that with a palette knife. I can take a palette knife if I want to soften this edge here, just come over it. Lose that edge. I want a hard edge here where it's light against dark. This is coming forward, that's going back. So that sharp edge does that. But in the shadow, all the edges are soft. So down in here, within the shadow of the cottonwood, I can soften these edges. Push and pull some of the paint around with a clean palette knife. Maybe lay in here a bit of blue. But again, as an exercise, this really works well. Because I can really see what the thick paint does. And if I'm having trouble with the color and the placement with the color, with the brush, I'll block everything in, or most everything, or at least the light area, in with palette knife. And that will simplify, get the paint thick, have it make more of an impact. Get some grasses growing up in front here. A little bit heavier, not heavier, less white in the ochre in front so that it comes forward. Have the lighter stand out in the background. And to show some of that texture of the dark and the light, I'm going to have to use a brush. So a little ochre and burnt sienna. With some subtle value change. Don't need a lot. Mess that up there, so use the brush to fix that. Pull that shadow out just a bit. Making the shadow a lot bigger than the reference has. So I think it'll make a better composition. Last thing here, since the trees are kind of the focal point, I want a few more sky holes in these trees just to give it some a little more natural shape. Not too many, because so easy to overdo. If 3 or 4 sky holes look great, 50 might look really good, but that's not the case. So a few negative strokes or sky holes to break up the shapes of the trees. Well, thanks for watching, and if that was helpful, click the like button and watch this next video on using brushwork to show form in your painting.